Do you want to know which serial killers have been the worst of all time? If so, you are not by yourself. Our society seems to have both a repulsion and fascination with serial killers' stories. Just look at all the serial killers movies and serial killers documentary out there. Who are these serial killers, and why do they feel the need to take another person's life? Actually, we don't know. What is certain is that human beings are capable of horrific things. Welcome everyone, but in today's video, we're going to look at America's most evil serial killers. But before we proceed, if you're new to this channel, remember, go ahead and to hit the bell icon to subscribe, so you won't miss the informative videos we will upload in the future. Now get ready and make sure to stay tuned till the end as we dive right into the video. Number 1. Edmund Kemper, known as the Coed Killer. Edmund Kemper is an American serial killer and necrophile who carried out a series of brutal murders in California in the 1970s. He murdered his grandparents when he was 15 years old, then later killed and dismembered 6 female hitchhikers in the Santa Cruz area. He then murdered his mother and one of her friends before turning himself in to the police days later. He was found guilty in November 1973 of 8 counts of murder. He asked for the death penalty, but instead received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Number 2. Larry Bittaker and Roy Norris. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, nicknamed the Toolbox Killers, are 2 American serial killers who together murdered 5 young women in California in 1979. Bittaker and Norris lured victims into their van and drove them to secluded areas where they both raped and tortured them horrifically before murdering them. In 1981, Bittaker and Norris were charged with murder, kidnapping, and rape. Bittaker was sentenced to death and remains on death row to this day. Update: Norris was spared execution in return for his testimony against Bittaker and sentenced to 45 years in prison. Number 3. Donald Henry Gaskins. In 1969, Gaskins began killing a series of hitchhikers he picked up while driving around the coastal highways of the American South, torturing and mutilating his victims. He claimed to have killed 80 to 90 people. He was arrested in 1975 when a criminal associate confessed to police that he had witnessed Gaskins killing 2 young men. He was convicted of 8 murders and was sentenced to death, which was later commuted to life imprisonment without parole. Remarkably, Gaskins went on to commit another murder within the high-security prison, killing a fellow inmate. He is the only man to have ever killed an inmate on death row. Number 4. Peter Manuel. An American-born Scottish serial killer known to have killed 9 people across southern Scotland between 1956 and 1958. Manuel is suspected of having killed as many as 18 people. Police were unable to prove his guilt until his final murders, when some banknotes Manuel had been using to pay for drinks in Glasgow pubs were proven to be stolen from one of his victims. He confessed to these murders after his mother confronted him at the police station where he was being held. Manuel was hanged at Glasgow's Barlinnie prison for his crimes in July 1958. He was one of the last prisoners to be hanged in Scotland before they ended capital punishment. Number 5. Richard Ramirez. Ricardo Levamugas Ramirez was an American serial killer and Satan worshipper who terrorized Los Angeles between 1984 and 1985. Nicknamed the Night Stalker, Ramirez broke into the homes of many of his victims and then shot, stabbed, wrapped, and mutilated them. His victims ranged between the ages of a 9-year-old girl to a married couple in their late 60s. Notably, he smeared pentagrams on the walls of his crime scenes. Captured in 1985, Ramirez was sentenced to death and remained on California's death row for 23 years until he died of complications from B-cell lymphoma in June 2013. Number 6. Jeffrey Dahmer. Known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer was an American serial killer and sex offender who raped, murdered, and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He also committed necrophilia and ate parts of his later victims, dismembering and cooking parts of their bodies. Dahmer was eventually caught after a would-be victim managed to overpower him and alert police. In 1992, Dahmer was convicted of 15 of the murders and sentenced to 15 terms of life in prison. However, just 2 years into his sentence, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution. Number 7. Ted Bundy. One of the most widely known murderers of the 20th century, Ted Bundy was an American serial killer and rapist who kidnapped or overpowered numerous young women and girls during the 1970s. Bundy typically approached his female victims in a public place and led them to secluded areas where he would sexually assault and kill them. He decapitated at least 12 victims and kept the severed heads in his apartment as trophies. Repeatedly captured, he twice managed to escape from police and courthouses before going on to commit 3 further killings. Convicted of multiple murders, he was sentenced to death and was executed via the electric chair in 1989. Number 8. Pedro Alonso Lopez. Pedro Alonso Lopez is a Colombian serial killer, accused of raping and killing more than 300 girls across South America. He lured them to secluded areas or inside unoccupied buildings where he raped each of them before killing them by a range of brutal methods, primarily strangulation. Lopez was arrested when an attempted abduction failed, and he was trapped by market traders. He confessed to over 300 murders, but the police only believed him when a flash flood uncovered a mass grave containing many of his victims. Eventually, 53 bodies were discovered. Imprisoned in 1980, he served 18 years before being released from an Ecuadorian prison and was deported to Colombia, where he was rearrested and in 2002 was sentenced to life. Number 9. Charles Manson. Charles Mills Manson was an American criminal and musician who led the Manson family, a cult based in California, in the late 1960s. Some of the members committed a series of 9 murders at 4 locations in July and August 1969. Like most of the people on this list, Charles Manson had a damaged childhood. Most serial killers either suffer through a traumatic event or have a traumatic childhood. This does not make his actions any less horrific. It's hard to say what makes a person a top serial killer, but if you have to pick one, we say the most famous of the bunch is a safe bet. Number 10. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer and sex offender, known as the Killer Clown, who assaulted and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy regularly performed at children's hospitals and charitable events as Pogo the Clown. JWG was beyond sick and barbaric, and the sheer numbers is mind-boggling. He kept the bodies of his victims under his house. They called him the Killer Clown. This guy should be number 1. The only person worse than him is Pedro Lopez. That's all for today's video. Feel free to share any helpful information we've missed in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos from our channel. Thanks for watching and see you all soon.